1944, Normandy. Fields that should have been pathways to liberation became graveyards for American engineers. Every 50 yards cleared, 3 men died. Standard mine detectors screamed false alarms at shell fragments, while missing the real killers buried deeper. Then a farm boy from Iowa suggested flooding a minefield with water. Officers laughed. 2 weeks later, 55 German telemines surfaced in a single field, every single one, without a single American casualty. 600 hours, June 18th, 1944, Carrington, Normandy. The air tasted of cordite and wet earth. Sergeant Tommy McRae knelt at the edge of a Norman wheat field, watching the sunrise paint blood-orange streaks across hedgerows that had swallowed 2 of his engineers the previous afternoon. The temperature hovered at 58 degrees. Somewhere beyond the morning mist, German artillery teams were waking up, calculating trajectories, preparing another day of methodical murder. 23 American engineers had died in the past 9 days, clearing mines from fields like this one, not in combat. In the agonizing work of crawling forward with SCR 625 mine detectors, prodding soft French soil with bayonets, sweating through each metallic ping that might mean a buried Teller mine or might mean another worthless scrap of shrapnel. The standard protocol was failing with brutal mathematical precision, 72% false positive rate. For every actual mine detected, engineers investigated 11 false alarms. Each investigation meant lying prone in the kill zone, hands trembling, probing blind. The strategic situation was deteriorating faster than Allied command publicly admitted. General Bradley's breakout from the beachhead required cleared routes through the bocage, the maze of ancient hedgerows and small fields that turned Normandy into a defender's paradise. Every uncleared field meant another day's delay. Every delay meant more German reinforcements arriving from the east. Intelligence estimated the enemy had seeded 40,000 mines across the sector. At current clearance rates, averaging 120 mines detected per week, at the cost of 2.3 engineer casualties per day, breaking through would take 9 months. The war would be lost before it properly began. Tommy McRae was 24 years old, from a family farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa. His hands were calloused from childhood summers, maintaining irrigation ditches, his back strong from hefting hay bales, his mind sharp from 4 years studying agricultural engineering at Iowa State before the war interrupted everything. He joined the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion because explosives made sense to him the same way soil composition and water tables did. But nothing in his training prepared him for the sight of Corporal Davies, a Brooklyn kid who'd never seen a cornfield before France, stepping on a Teller mine that the detector had somehow missed. The German S-mine was worse. It popped up to waist height before detonating, designed specifically to maximize casualties. The screaming lasted 40 seconds. Lieutenant Harrison, a West Point graduate with textbook knowledge and zero imagination, insisted on following doctrine exactly. The manual says sweep in grid patterns, investigate every contact, mark and neutralize. The manual was written by men who'd never crawled through Norman mud with their face 6 inches from a pressure plate that could turn them into red mist. What if we're thinking about this wrong? Tommy had suggested 3 days earlier, standing in a barn converted to a command post. Maps covered a table made from a farmhouse door. Outside, rain hammered the roof, the 4th straight day of it. Water pooled everywhere, turning roads to soup, filling foxholes, making every movement miserable. "Explain," Harrison said without looking up from his clipboard. "Back home, when we wanted to find underground springs or check irrigation line integrity, we'd flood the field. Water finds every pathway, every cavity. Pressure differential makes things visible. What if we flooded a suspected minefield? Teller mines are metal. They displace water differently than soil. We could mark them without ever getting close." Harrison's expression suggested Tommy had proposed attacking with water balloons. "Sergeant, we don't have time for agricultural experiments. We have detection equipment. We follow procedure." But procedure was killing them. 50 yards of cleared field per day, 3 engineers in body bags per 50 yards. The mathematics of attrition were inescapable. The decision came not from Harrison but from desperation. On June 16th, an entire squad, 8 men, was obliterated when a mine they'd marked as cleared detonated under a supply truck. Fragments of the SCR-625 detector were found 30 yards away. The equipment itself had been faulty, its batteries weakened by constant moisture, its calibration thrown off by the iron-rich Norman soil. Colonel Patterson arrived that evening, a career officer who'd commanded combat engineers since North Africa. He gathered the survivors in the barn. Rain dripped through holes in the roof. 23 faces stared back at him, boys who'd aged a decade in 9 days. "I'm open to suggestions," Patterson said quietly, "because what we're doing isn't working." Tommy stepped forward. He explained it again, this time with sketches on the back of a ration box. The principle was simple: controlled flooding to create visual differentiation. Mines buried 6 to 8 inches deep would create subtle surface disturbances when water pooled above them. The displacement pattern would be visible from a safe distance, no physical contact required, no false alarms from shell fragments, just basic physics applied to an immediate tactical problem. "You want to flood a minefield," Patterson said slowly. "With water?" "Yes, sir. We control the water flow, monitor the surface changes, mark every displacement anomaly, then confirm with detectors from a safe distance before any engineer gets close." The barn was silent except for rain. "How long to set up a test?" Patterson asked. "Give me 36 hours and a field we know is mined. I'll need pumps, hoses, and men who aren't afraid of getting wet." Harrison started to object. Patterson raised a hand. 36 hours, Sergeant. Make it work." Dawn, June 19th, 1944. The test site was a rectangular wheat field, 60 yards by 40, designated Field 7 Alpha on tactical maps. French civilians confirmed Germans had mined it during their retreat. Aerial reconnaissance showed disturbed soil patterns, suggesting at least 20 telemines, possibly more. It was perfect and potentially lethal. Tommy assembled his team in the pre-dawn darkness. 6 volunteers, Corporal Jensen from Minnesota, who understood water flow from ice fishing experience, Private First Class Rodriguez from South Texas, whose family had managed irrigation for 3 generations, Private Miller from the Bronx, a plumber's son who could jury-rig anything, Sergeant Davis, a black engineer from Alabama who'd built levees for the TVA before the Army reluctantly accepted him, Private Kowalski from Wisconsin, whose dairy farm had the best drainage system in his county, and Private First Class O'Brien from Boston, who simply refused to watch more friends die following procedures that didn't work. Equipment was the first nightmare. The battalion had 2 gasoline-powered water pumps, designed for filling water buffaloes, mobile tanks for drinking water. Each pump could move 300 gallons per hour, hopelessly inadequate for flooding a 2,400 square yard field. Tommy needed at least 1,500 gallons minimum to create sufficient water depth for visible displacement patterns. Miller solved it with American ingenuity and flexible interpretation of property rights. He requisitioned fire pumps from the town of Carentan, antique hand-operated systems the French had used since Napoleon. Combined with the battalion pumps and hoses cannibalized from damaged vehicles, they assembled a Frankenstein water delivery system held together with wire, hope, and a shocking amount of profanity in 3 languages. Water source was problem 2. The nearest creek was 400 yards away across an open field that German snipers had zeroed. Moving pumps and hoses in daylight meant casualties. They worked at night, crawling forward with equipment, setting up by feel, Jensen directing placement based on topography he'd memorized during daylight reconnaissance. The physical environment fought them constantly. Normandy in June meant rain, followed by brief sun, followed by more rain. The soil was dense clay, mixed with centuries of agricultural amendments. It absorbed water slowly, creating runoff problems. Nighttime temperatures dropped to 45 degrees, cold enough that wet clothing meant hypothermia risk. Men worked soaked through, shivering, operating by touch because flashlights drew fire. Boredom and terror alternated with brutal unpredictability. Hours of tedious hose connection and pump maintenance interrupted by sudden German artillery salvos that sent everyone diving into ditches, followed by the agonizing wait to confirm everyone survived. Sleep came in 15-minute intervals between crises. Food was cold rations eaten while standing in mud. Coffee tasted like diesel because the only hot water came from engine radiator runoff. The psychological weight was crushing. Every man knew that if Tommy's theory was wrong, they were wasting desperately needed time and resources. Harrison made certain they understood this, visiting the site to deliver pointed commentary about agricultural fantasies and career-ending failures. A doubt crept in during the cold hours. What if the water just soaked into the ground? What if mines didn't displace water the way Tommy calculated? What if they'd just volunteered for elaborate suicide? But Americans had a talent for making impossible things work through sheer stubborn refusal to accept failure. When pumps failed, Miller rebuilt them using parts from a destroyed German truck. When hoses burst, Kowalski patched them with tire rubber and radiator clamps. When the water source proved too distant, Davis engineered a relay system using shell craters as intermediate reservoirs, creating a multi-stage pumping network that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. The practical challenges multiplied geometrically. They needed to flood the field uniformly to make displacement patterns visible. But the ground sloped slightly northeast to southwest, creating natural runoff channels that drained water faster than pumps could deliver it. Rodriguez solved this by constructing temporary berms using sandbags and soil, creating a controlled basin. It took 8 hours of backbreaking work in darkness, every shovelful potentially the one that hit a mine. Weather became both enemy and ally. Rain on June 20th delayed the test by 12 hours, but also softened the soil, improving water retention. Brief sunshine the next morning dried the surface layer just enough to prevent complete saturation, creating the perfect conditions for visible displacement. It was luck, but Americans had always believed they made their own luck through preparation and hard work. June 21st, 05:30 hours. Everything was ready. 6 pumps positioned along the field's western edge, hoses snaking across 400 yards of cleared ground, temporary berms forming a shallow basin. Tommy stood at the observation point, a destroyed German bunker offering elevated view and hard cover. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold this time. Patterson stood beside him, binoculars ready. Harrison had positioned himself conspicuously distant, preparing his "I told you so" speech. "Start the pumps," Tommy ordered. The gasoline engines coughed to life. Water began flowing, a steady stream that looked pathetically inadequate against the field's vastness. Gallons became tens of gallons, became hundreds. The field began to change. Dry earth darkened, puddles formed and merged. The temporary berms held mostly. Water crept across the wheat stubble, inch by inch, transforming the killing ground into a shallow, muddy lake. 20 minutes, 30, 45. Water depth reached 2 inches, 3. The field was a mirror reflecting grey morning sky. And then Tommy saw it, a subtle circular disturbance, 15 yards from the western edge. The water there was slightly raised, maybe a quarter-inch higher than surrounding areas. Surface tension created a visible meniscus around something buried below. "There," he breathed. "Mark it." Rodriguez, watching from a different angle, called out, "Got another one, 20 yards northeast of first contact." Then Miller, "I see 3 more. Jesus, they're everywhere." The pattern emerged like a photograph in developing solution. Circular disturbances appeared across the field, each marking displaced water pushed upward by buried metal objects less dense than saturated soil. No false alarms from shell fragments. Those were too small to create measurable displacement. Only the mines mattered. Only the mines showed. In 90 minutes, they identified 55 distinct displacement patterns, 55 mines. They marked each position using white surveyors' stakes, driven into the ground from safe distance, creating a visible grid of death that had been invisible yesterday. Patterson lowered his binoculars. His expression suggested he was watching something that contradicted everything he'd learned at West Point. "Confirm them," he said quietly. "Metal detectors, if even one is a false positive." Tommy assembled a confirmation team. They approached each marked position using standard protocol, detectors sweeping carefully. Every single displacement pattern confirmed positive for buried metal consistent with teller mine signatures. 55 marks, 55 mines, 0 false alarms, 0 casualties. Harrison said nothing. There was nothing to say. June 22nd, 1944. German 302nd Infantry Division Headquarters. Oberst Heinrich Müller studied the intelligence report with growing confusion that bordered on professional offense. His combat engineers had meticulously mined Field 7 Alpha 3 weeks earlier using standard Rigel-Stellung patterns, staggered mine placement designed to create maximum casualties during clearance operations. 58 teller mines, sophisticated pressure fuse systems, buried at optimal depth with topsoil carefully replaced to eliminate visual detection. The American advance through that sector should have cost them 20 to 30 engineers over 3 days minimum. Instead, according to reconnaissance reports, they'd cleared the entire field in under 4 hours. 0 casualties. Perfect mine location accuracy. How? Müller demanded of his intelligence officer. "Unknown, Herr Oberst. Our observer reported unusual American activity, pumping water onto the field. He assumed it was some form of decontamination procedure or possibly a psychological tactic. He did not realize it was mine detection methodology. Water. The Americans were using water to detect mines. It was absurd. It violated basic military engineering doctrine that relied on sophisticated electronic detection equipment and methodical hand-probing techniques. The German military had developed mine detection procedures refined through years of combat experience on the Eastern Front. Those procedures assumed enemy clearance would follow recognizable patterns: electronic sweeps, visual inspection, careful probing. The Americans had simply ignored all established doctrine and improvised something that shouldn't work, but demonstrably did. Müller had encountered American forces before. He'd fought them in North Africa, where their tactical naivety cost them initial defeats at Kasserine Pass. But he'd also watched them learn with terrifying speed, adapting their doctrine mid-campaign in ways German command structure, rigid, hierarchical, dependent on orders from above, could never match. American junior officers and NCOs were authorized to experiment, to discard procedures that didn't work, to try ridiculous improvisations like flooding minefields. The philosophical difference was fundamental. German military excellence came from precision, training, and adherence to proven methods. American military effectiveness came from chaos barely controlled, from individual initiative valued over institutional procedure, from a cultural assumption that good enough and fast beat perfect and slow. Müller's mine doctrine assumed enemies would clear at predictable rates using predictable methods. He could calculate American losses, estimate breakthrough timelines, plan defensive responses. But if Americans could clear fields in hours instead of days, if they could do it without casualties, if they could scale this water-flooding technique across the entire sector, what are our countermeasures? He asked. The intelligence officer consulted notes. We could bury mines deeper, but that reduces pressure plate effectiveness. We could use non-metallic casings, but production cannot supply sufficient quantities. We could increase mine density, but our stockpiles are already critically low. Herr Oberst, there is no immediate doctrinal counter to this technique, because German doctrine didn't account for enemies who flooded battlefields to detect mines. It was agricultural thinking applied to warfare. It was improvisation so far outside standard military procedure that planning for it had never seemed necessary. The first field engagement, where this became devastatingly clear, occurred on June 23rd. German forces had established a strong defensive position anchored on a cluster of mined approaches. Standard defensive doctrine: force attackers into kill zones covered by pre-registered artillery, delay their advance with mine barriers requiring extensive clearance time, counterattack while they're immobilized. The Americans arrived at 0700. By 0900, they'd flooded 3 suspected minefields, marked 63 mines, and cleared 2 approach routes. Armor rolled through by 1,000 hours, weeks ahead of German defensive timeline predictions. The defensive position collapsed, not from superior American firepower, but from superior American speed, enabled by mine clearance techniques German planners had never imagined possible. Lieutenant Franz Weber, commanding a pioneer platoon tasked with minefield maintenance, watched through binoculars as Americans set up their water pumps. "They cannot be serious," he muttered, but they were serious. Deadly serious, and it was working. Weber reported to Müller that evening. "Our mine barriers are now tactical delays, measuring hours instead of days. We cannot sustain defensive positions if Americans achieve breakthrough mobility this rapidly." Müller understood the implication. The entire German defensive strategy in Normandy assumed time. Time for reinforcements, time to reposition forces, time to establish successive defensive lines. American mine clearance speed collapsed those timelines. What should have taken weeks would take days. German forces would be continuously reacting, never able to establish stable defensive positions. The arrogance of assuming American tactical incompetence was becoming a strategic liability. Müller had dismissed early reports of American ingenuity as propaganda or luck. He'd assumed inexperience would manifest as predictable failures. Instead, American willingness to experiment, to empower low-ranking soldiers to solve tactical problems with agricultural techniques or plumbing improvisations, was producing battlefield results that German doctrine couldn't counter. When Müller briefed division command on the water-flooding mine detection technique, the response was institutional disbelief. "This cannot be standard American procedure," the division commander insisted. "It must be isolated improvisation by a rogue engineer unit." But intelligence soon confirmed it was spreading. Other American engineer battalions were adopting the technique. Fields across the sector were being flooded, cleared, and opened to armor advance at rates that made previous timeline estimates obsolete. The innovation born from one Iowa farm boy's refusal to accept casualties as inevitable was becoming widespread American operational practice. The perplexity was profound. How did you fight an enemy that refused to follow predictable patterns? How did you plan defenses against forces that improvised solutions faster than you could develop counters? The American military wasn't better trained or better equipped than German forces, but it was faster to adapt, more willing to experiment, less bound by rigid doctrine. By June 28th, German mine effectiveness in the Normandy sector had declined by estimated 78%. Not because Americans had better mine detectors, because they'd used water pumps and farm boy ingenuity to render sophisticated German mine warfare doctrine largely obsolete. Müller recommended immediate doctrinal revision and new mine deployment strategies. By the time those recommendations filtered through command hierarchy and new procedures were approved, the breakout from Normandy had already begun. August 15th, 1944. Field 7 Alpha, Normandy. Tommy McRae stood in the field where it had all started. The wheat had been harvested by grateful French farmers who'd returned to find their land cleared, usable, safe for their children. 55 white crosses marked where telemines had been neutralized. Someone, probably local civilians, had planted flowers at each marker. A small memorial to death prevented. The war had moved east. Patton's Third Army was racing across France, enabled partly by engineer units that could clear mine barriers in hours instead of weeks. The water flooding technique had spread throughout American combat engineer battalions, refined and systematized. Official doctrine now included controlled flooding for mine detection in appropriate soil conditions as a standard clearance option. Tommy had been promoted to lieutenant and reassigned to training command, teaching the technique to new engineer units. The statistics were stark and irrefutable. In the 6 weeks since Field 7 Alpha's successful clearance, American combat engineers using water flooding methods had detected and neutralized over 4,000 mines across the Normandy sector. Casualty rates for mine clearance operations had dropped by 81%. Fields that previously required 3 days to clear were being opened in 6 hours. The mathematical difference between defeat and victory, often measured in hours saved, casualties prevented, and momentum maintained. But numbers didn't capture the human reality. 23 engineers had died before June 21st. After June 21st, across operations using the water method, 4 casualties total, none fatal. The men who would have died, Miller, Rodriguez, Davis, Kowalski, O'Brien, Jensen, and dozens of others, were alive, writing letters home, complaining about food, making plans for after the war. Survival made possible because one man refused to accept that the way things had always been done was the only way things could be done. Colonel Patterson authorized official recognition. Tommy received the Bronze Star for innovation under combat conditions. The citation mentioned tactical ingenuity, significantly reducing casualties and enhancing operational tempo. It didn't mention the 3 days of working in freezing rain, the terror of testing an untried method, or the institutional resistance from officers who valued procedure over results. More meaningful was the unofficial recognition from engineers who'd survived because of the technique. They called it McCrae's flood, or sometimes just the Iowa trick. A corporal from Pennsylvania told Tommy, "My kid'll grow up with a father because you remembered how to flood a field. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you anyway." The long-term consequences rippled outward in ways Tommy couldn't have predicted. The demonstrated effectiveness of water flooding for mine detection influenced post-war doctrine development. Engineering schools at Fort Belvoir incorporated the technique into curriculum. The principle that unconventional solutions might solve problems where established methods failed became quietly embedded in American military culture's tolerance for innovation at junior levels. The collaboration that produced the successful test also demonstrated value in diverse perspectives. Davis, the black engineer from Alabama, whose expertise with levees proved essential, received commendation despite serving in a still segregated army. Rodriguez's irrigation knowledge, Jensen's ice fishing experience, Miller's plumbing skills, individual expertise from specific American regional experiences combined to solve a problem that stumped West Point-trained officers. It was validation that American strength came not from uniform conformity, but from diverse backgrounds solving problems together. The civilian applications emerged years later. Post-war, the principle of using water displacement for detection found applications in agricultural landmine clearance, particularly in Europe and Asia. Humanitarian demining operations in the 1990s rediscovered and refined variations of Tommy's original technique. Fields made safe for farming in Cambodia, Angola, and Bosnia owed conceptual debt to an Iowa farm boy who understood water, soil, and displacement physics. Tommy himself returned to Cedar Rapids in November 1945. He completed his agricultural engineering degree on the GI Bill, married his high school sweetheart, and managed irrigation systems for central Iowa farms. He rarely talked about the war. When pressed, he'd say only, "I helped solve a problem, that's all." But those who'd been there understood it was never all. In July 1994, the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion held its final reunion. 37 survivors gathered in Des Moines. They were old men now, their wars long finished, their battles reduced to carefully edited stories told to grandchildren. They dedicated a small memorial at the Iowa State University Engineering Building, a simple plaque noting that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that lives saved are victories as important as battles won, that an Iowa farm boy's understanding of water physics changed the course of operations in Normandy. Field 7 Alpha in Normandy became a minor historical footnote, mentioned briefly in specialized military engineering texts. Historians focused on D-Day beaches, on Operation Cobra's breakout, on Patton's dramatic drives across France. The quiet work of engineers flooding fields to find mines didn't generate dramatic photographs or newspaper headlines. But the men who walked across those cleared fields, who advanced through sectors that should have been impassable, who survived because mines were found without casualties, they understood. Innovation born from desperation, refined through determination, and validated through results. One soldier's laughable water trick that exposed 55 German mines in one field with 0 losses. A technique that spread across armies, saved thousands of lives, and proved that sometimes the best solutions come not from sophisticated technology, but from fundamental understanding of physics, persistence in the face of skepticism, and willingness to try something that conventional wisdom said couldn't work. The wheat grows in Field 7 Alpha now. French farmers harvest it every summer. The white crosses are gone, replaced by productive agriculture. The mines are history. But the lesson remains that ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can solve impossible problems when they refuse to accept that the old ways are the only ways. That American strength lies not in rigid adherence to doctrine, but in willingness to experiment, adapt, and value results over procedure. That farm boys from Iowa sometimes save more lives with water pumps than generals save with armies. Tommy McRae died in 1989, surrounded by family, in a farmhouse outside Cedar Rapids. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned military service, but not the Bronze Star, not Field 7 Alpha, not the 55 mines or the thousands of lives saved. Just served with distinction in W-Taus, returned to agriculture. But in military engineering communities, in humanitarian demining organizations, in classrooms where future engineers learn that problems have multiple solutions and conventional wisdom sometimes misses better answers, the story endures. The Iowa farm boy who understood that water finds every cavity, reveals every hidden danger, and makes the invisible visible. Who proved that the most sophisticated solution isn't always the best solution. Who demonstrated that American ingenuity, applied with determination and validated through courage, can transform catastrophe into triumph and death into survival. The wheat still grows. That's what matters. The fields are safe, the children play, the war is memory. But the principle remains. When conventional methods fail, when casualties mount, when the old ways lead only to more death, sometimes salvation comes from thinking differently, from remembering that water flows, that physics doesn't care about doctrine, that a laughable trick might just save everyone. If this story of American ingenuity, determination and courage moved you, if you believe these forgotten heroes deserve recognition, hit that subscribe button and join our community honoring the unsung heroes of World War II. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts. What wartime innovation amazes you most? Your grandfather's service, the American spirit that turned impossible into inevitable. Let's keep these stories alive together, because they fought so we could remember. And we owe them that much.